native fishing place and village, Wamasett, later Lowell, inhabited for thousands of years prior to European colonization. 1635–1725 settlement. In 1635, a small band of settlers landed at the northern edge of the Parker River in present-day Newbury. They had been persuaded to leave Boston to help establish the northern boundary of Massachusetts Bay Colony against rival claims. The first settlers found the Parker and Merrimack rivers full of fish, and lumber was plentiful. These two commodities were the foundation of the area's economy. The activities of the settlement were primarily agricultural, but by 1660, small fishing sloops and coastal shallops were being built. Between 1681 and 1714, shipbuilding was constructed on a larger scale, and over 100 vessels were built in Newbury. The early 18th century saw the focus start to shift from the agriculturally based community of Newbury to a maritime and mercantile-oriented town along the river. By 1707, the first wharves and residences were built along its southern edge. This area was referred to as Waterside. By 1725, Waterside boasted a substantial population and increased riverfront activity. Disputes between agrarian and maritime interests led to a petition for Newbury to be set off and incorporated as a separate town. In 1764, the town of Newburyport was created by order of the General Court. Following the lead of Boston and Salem in the 18th century, Newbury exported fish and timber to the West Indies to be exchanged for molasses and sugar. Part of this cargo was re-exported to Europe. Part was brought back to New England, and the molasses was made into rum. This highly profitable triangle trade formed the base of the New England economy. The collector of customs registered huge quantities of molasses imported and unloaded in Newburyport. 1725–1790 colonial Newburyport. Some 500 families inhabited the new town. Shipbuilding was a growing industry. In 1766, 72 vessels were built, and in 1772, 90 vessels were launched. Most were purchased by England. By the third quarter of the 18th century, Newburyport had become the center of New England shipbuilding. West Indian trade was brisk on the eve of the Revolution. Between 1756 and 1765, 427 Newbury-built vessels entered customs at Salem or Boston. In September 1775, early in the American Revolutionary War, Colonel Benedict Arnold led a force of 1,100 Continental Army troops on an expedition from Newburyport to Quebec City. The expedition was part of a two-pronged invasion of the British province of Quebec. Nathaniel Tracy outfitted the first privateers of the Revolution. An extraordinarily wealthy man, he was owner of 120 vessels, 54 of these either privateers or cruisers. Beside his fleet, Tracy loaned $167,000 to the fledgling government. The war cost him his fortune. Both the frigates Hancock and Boston were built and equipped in Newbury. President George Washington visits Newburyport in 1789, and the following year, lighthouses ceded to federal government. President George Washington appointed Abner Lowell as first superintendent of lighthouses on Plum Island. The U.S. revenue cutter Massachusetts launched in 1791. Built by William Searle, and when Alexander Hamilton was Secretary of the Treasury, she was the first such vessel in the service of the United States, thus allowing Newburyport to claim the birthplace of the U.S. Coast Guard. The War of Independence was disastrous to shipbuilding and trade. Independence destroyed the English market for ships and goods. The economic growth of the town was sharply curtailed. Private fortunes were lost, marking the end of an era. 1790–1815, an international port. By 1790, Newburyport began to recover from the after-effects of the Revolution. Within 3 years, the population increased to 5,000, and the registered tonnage at the Custom House for 1793 was 18,000. Between 1791 and 1794, the value of Newburyport's exports doubled from $250,000 to $490,000. In 1799, perhaps one of the most famous local vessels was built in nearby Amesbury, the Essex, which gained international attention when sunk by a whale in 1820, thus inspiring Herman Melville to write Moby Dick. Ship construction continued, but it was eclipsed by foreign trade. Fish and lumber remained the basic exports. European nations were embroiled in the Napoleonic Wars, and this placed the United States in the position of being the sole neutral carrier of food and other goods. During the first years of the 19th century, Newburyport reached its zenith as an internationally known seaport, with every ship's cargo inspected by the custom house officers. This growth, however, stopped before the end of the decade. The 1807 Embargo Act, subsequent non-intercourse acts, and the War of 1812 closed European markets to American traders. In 1811, the Great Fire destroyed 25 acres of the commercial district and resulted in $1,000 worth of damage. As settlements moved upriver, Newburyport had served as the distribution center for towns along the Merrimack, but construction of the Middlesex Canal in 1803 rerouted interior trade directly to Boston instead. By 1815, the total value and tonnage of the town was two-thirds of what it had been in 1807, and Newburyport lost her status as an international port. 1815-1900, the clipper ship era. The trilogy of fateful events that welcomed Newburyport to the 19th century, embargo, fire, and war, could hardly foretell a century of astounding progress and wealth, marked by a period of modernization and an embrace of the industrial age. During the 1830s and 40s, the town's fortunes improved, due as always to her waterfront location. Some older industries were revived, specifically fishing and shipbuilding, the latter rejuvenated by the rise of the clipper ship, invented locally by noted ship designer Donald Mackay in 1842. And new industries, particularly large steam-powered mills, took advantage of merchant shipping to import raw materials and export finished goods. By 1851, the town's renaissance was complete, and on June 3rd, the city of Newburyport was voted into existence. The 25 years following the city's incorporation, and like the rest of the country, were dominated by the Civil War. Known as history's first modern conflict, the Civil War introduced technologies such as telegraphy and photography, which soon found their way into everyday life. And while a railroad had been running through Newburyport since 1840, the Newburyport City Railroad, the well-known spur line which ran along the waterfront, began operating in August 1872. The last Massachusetts-built square rigger, the Mary L. Cushing, was built in 1883, after which the Courier shipyard was closed for good, thus ending the era of large wind-powered merchant vessels. 1900-1975, a new era begins. In 1876, the Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company built a large 5-story coal pocket along the waterfront. It was the primary facility for storing and distributing coal, until it burned down in the $1 Million Fire of 1934. After the loss of the coal industry, Newburyport went into decline. On Plum Island, however, powered controlled flight took off. Starling Burgess and Augustus Herring are credited with launching New England aviation with flights off the marshes in 1910. The Custom House closed that same year, then took on a number of new roles over the next 50 years, from a manufacturing site for heels of women's shoes owned by Joseph Pollard to a scrap iron business, a function that left significant cracks in the main hallway's marble floor. The two world wars, of course, had an effect on the city. Private Eben Bradbury Jr. was the first local soldier to be killed in WWI at age 20. There is a monument dedicated to him on Bartlett Mall. Many Newburyporters served overseas during World War II in all theaters. 43 would never return. In the 1960s, among many firsts in its long history, Newburyport pioneered the use of federal urban renewal funds for the restoration and reuse of historic structures. Using architectural designs by William Perry, best known for restoration of colonial Williamsburg, to restore Market Square, the Department of Housing and Urban Development was convinced to try something new, equals paying for a restoration project instead of demolishing the old buildings and starting over. Newburyport became the first such federally funded project, followed by similar efforts in Salem, Portsmouth, NH, and Boston. This forward-thinking vision saved the historical integrity of downtown Newburyport, and this Custom House when it opened as a museum in 1975. The city's forward-looking, preservation-conscious mindset continues to this day. Robert Mills, 1835 Custom House. The first Newburyport Custom House, Est. 1790, was located on State Street. It was lost in the Great Fire of 1811. The Customs Service continued in a rented space until Congress approved this building in 1834. Architect Robert Mills, 1781 to 1855, was chosen to design the new Custom House. Mills was also responsible for the designs of the Washington Monument and U.S. Treasury Building in Washington, D.C. Signature features can be seen in the cantilevered staircase and in the vaulted ceilings. Also known as a floating staircase, this is achieved using independent beam steps, each of which are anchored to a bearing wall, giving the hovering appearance of the staircase. The barrel vault, aka a tunnel vault, is achieved by the laying of successive arches. The building was designed in the Greek Revival style, a popular architectural movement of the late 18th and early 19th century that drew inspiration from the features of the temples of ancient Greece. Note the large Doric columns of the entryway and the triangular pediment of the facade of the building. The large front doors are original. The cornerstone for the building was laid in 1834. Local building contractors William Palmer and David Hazeltine completed the building in 1835 using granite quarried in Quincy, Massachusetts, and shipped by barge to this location. The final cost of the construction was $23,000. The building was renovated in 1872. The checkered marble floors were installed, as well as large plate glass windows. After 75 years as an active federal custom house, the import of goods into Newburyport had waned. Larger ships carrying more cargo had an increasingly difficult times navigating the sandbars and shallower waters of the Merrimack River. Ultimately, the Newburyport Custom House was decommissioned in 1910 and subsequently sold by the federal government. The Collector of Customs, a custom house, is where duties were paid on imported cargoes coming into port. The Customs Service in the early United States grew directly out of the Royal Customs System that had collected taxes during the colonial period. The U.S. Customs Service had the same appointed officers, responsibilities, and procedures as the former Royal Service. The irony of the establishment of the U.S. Customs Service in 1789 was that the same system of tariffs had created the rift between Great Britain and the colonies less than 2 decades earlier. Prior to the American Revolution, the major ports with custom houses in the region were Boston, Salem, Marblehead, and Portsmouth. Prior 1790, Newburyport did not have one. In July of 1789, the U.S. Congress passed 3 acts that provided for administering customs tariffs and collecting duties on imported goods and merchandises. These acts established ports of entry and 09 customs collection districts in the 11 states that had ratified the new Constitution. This included the establishment of a custom house in Newburyport, to which were annexed Amesbury, Salisbury, and Haverhill as ports of delivery. The Newburyport district ran from the New Hampshire border to the bounds of Ipswich, Massachusetts. Administration of customs laws was placed under the Secretary of the Treasury, who appointed a collector of customs for each district. At the time of its creation, that role was filled by Alexander Hamilton. Of the many duties of the Collector of Customs, he would also appoint other officers, including surveyors, inspectors, weighers, as well as gaugers and measurers. These officers were responsible for evaluating all cargo entering port by weight, volume, and/or quality to determine the taxes owed. 3 becomes 1. Birth of the U.S. Coast Guard. U.S. Revenue Cutter Service established by an act of Congress on August 4, 1790, authorizing the construction and equipment of cutters to enforce the collection of customs and tonnage duties. The Revenue Cutter Service was supervised by collectors of customs from 1791 to 1871 and was under the administrative control of the Department of the Treasury. Between 10 and 20 cutters at a time were in commission during the Revenue Marine's first half-century. The responsibilities of the service went beyond its customs and tonnage duties to include suppression of smuggling, piracy, and the slave trade, the assistance of ships, removal of navigation hazards, enforcement of quarantine regulations, neutrality laws, laws prohibiting the importation of Chinese coolie labor, and after 1867, enforced regulations in Alaska concerning the unauthorized killing of fur-bearing animals, protection of fisheries, as well as firearms, ammunition, and liquor trafficking. A new Revenue Marine Division, established 1871, became the Revenue Cutter Service by Act of July 31, 1894. In 1915, the Revenue Cutter Service merged with the U.S. Life-Saving Service to form the U.S. Coast Guard. 3 becomes 1. Birth of the U.S. Coast Guard. U.S. Life-Saving Service. Founded in 1780. Birth of the U.S. Coast Guard. U.S. Lighthouse Service. On August 7, 1789, the first U.S. Congress passed an act for the establishment and support of lighthouses, beacons, buoys, and public piers. The act provided that all expenses which shall accrue in the necessary support, maintenance, and repairs of all lighthouses, beacons, buoys, and public piers erected, placed, or sunk before the passing of this act, at the entrance of, or within any bay, inlet, harbor, or port of the United States, for rendering the navigation thereof easy and safe, shall be defrayed out of the Treasury of the United States. The act stipulated that it fell to the Secretary of the Treasury to provide contracts, rebuild, when necessary, provide supplies, and keep in good repair the lighthouses, beacons, buoys, and public piers of the several states. In 1789, the Secretary of the Treasury was Alexander Hamilton, also the intellectual architect of the U.S. Customs Service. The local control and responsibility for lighthouses of a given port was assigned to the Collector of Customs. The United States Lighthouse Establishment, USLHE, became the U.S. Lighthouse Service in 1910 and was integrated into the U.S. Coast Guard in 1939. U.S. Coast Guard Station Merrimack River. The Merrimack River Station is one of only 20 surf stations in the Coast Guard. Its primary missions include search and rescue and law enforcement. The Coast Guard's presence in Newburyport has evolved over time in response to changes in technology, maritime commerce, and national security threats. It continues to play a vital role in safeguarding the region's maritime interests and promoting safety and security at sea. Newburyport's proximity to the Atlantic Ocean means that the Coast Guard has conducted numerous search and rescue missions to assist distressed mariners, whether due to vessel accidents, medical emergencies, or other reasons. The Coast Guard enforces maritime laws and regulations to ensure safety and security in the region's waters. This includes combating illegal fishing, drug trafficking, and other illicit activities, inspecting vessels for compliance with safety regulations, conducting investigations into maritime accidents, and providing guidance on marine safety issues are also key functions of the Coast Guard in Newburyport. Protecting the marine environment is another important aspect of the mission. This includes responding to oil spills, enforcing pollution regulations, and conducting environmental assessments. Maintaining navigational aids such as buoys, lighthouses, and electronic navigation systems helps ensure the safe passage of vessels through the region's waterways. Newburyport's black sailors. Throughout the 18th century, Newburyport merchants participated in the triangular trade, importing West Indian molasses and exporting rum made from it. By the mid-18th century, while purchasing enslaved people in Massachusetts was illegal, ownership via purchase elsewhere was not. Thus, prominent Newburyport households often included African and Native American enslaved people. Once Massachusetts abolished slavery in 1783, black sailors would have been a mainstay in a maritime port like Newburyport. The 1820 census shows almost 100 black residents, compared to 10 in Newbury, 15 in Salisbury, and 2 in West Newbury. Often a life at sea was a smart option for those who escaped slavery before the Civil War, and particularly after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. About half of the black male population worked as mariners by the mid-19th century. Surviving crew lists filed with this custom house between 1815 and 1854, which were required only for voyages outside U.S. boundaries, identify about 270 sailors as black, man of color, or colored. These lists document physical characteristics such as complexion and hair color, plus place of birth. The vast majority of black sailors were listed only once, though roughly 25 made multiple voyages. Crew enlistment peaked in the 1820s and 1830s, though entries were found on lists in every decade.
Okay, let's go.